So, continue our reflections on the topic of faith. I know we started out the first class, I talked about just faith in a very immediate way of trusting emergence, trusting one's ability to meet the moment as it arises, beginning to have confidence in that instead of, more trying to foresee things, all things, so forth. It's not that those things are bad. Obviously, we human beings rely on them a lot, but we need to understand we have this ability to just meet what arises. Tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that and about choices. Or as we're meeting what arises, there are often choices being made. And sometimes one has, kind of larger choices that come into play. It's kind of interesting to me to think of a course of a life and sort of the roads that you took, the choices that you made, and what chose them. How were they chosen? Were they chosen by thought? Were they chosen by feeling? I tend to be a feeling kind of chooser. I sometimes feel like I get tangled up in my head trying to choose because I don't ever really feel like that's where the choices come from. And it's really for me a part of faith to discern this kind of yes or no that arises in the face of certain things. Whether I'm going to do something or, if you think of, for instance, following a certain teacher, what is that? There's so many things out there in the spiritual smorgasbord, so many things laid out. What is it that makes the choice? For me, I find that there's just a sense that I have that there's something here for me in a choice. If I meet someone, I might have a sense, that getting to know them better is important. I don't really know why necessarily. It's more of a felt sense. Something brightens up. There's a kind of response of life to a situation. And conversely, there's often a no. Something doesn't light up. It's a little hard to discern this in the midst of our conditioning, and our identities and our thoughts about ourselves and our preferences, our likes and our dislikes. So sometimes when I talk this way, people think that one is simply choosing what one likes and avoiding what one doesn't like. But I find that it's actually subtler than that. And I have explored to some degree this sense that there is an intelligence, and I find that it's located in the belly. But don't take that too literally. It can be a whole body kind of sense as well. But the belly is kind of the center of gravity for the whole body, so that's partly why it also feels like it's there. Some kind of intelligence that discerns a path in front of us and which way to go. The head can come up with reasons. The head can come with advantages and disadvantages. It can sift through a lot. But I sense there's something else that has to weigh in for a choice, to step into something or step away from something else that tells us that. And I suspect that we don't always trust that. I certainly have overridden my senses of what to do with some sense of duty that comes from my head, or fear, or sense of what other people would think, or what is kind of the conventional wisdom of how to be or how to choose. And so that happens really easily. But I think if I didn't follow that, for one, I wouldn't be here teaching today. There was a moment in my life which required a great deal of faith, actually, when I was living in Seattle. And I felt like I felt like I had a vocation. Oh, that's a funny word for use in Buddhism, because that seems to imply it's a calling, a God who calls. I don't necessarily mean it that way, but I felt like there was a purpose in my life, and it had to do with teaching the Dharma. And I didn't quite know how to get there. And I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I needed more training. And I specifically didn't know one core teaching of Buddhism. It hadn't really quite landed in me, the teaching of not self. Some of you who've been more around the block in Buddhism will know this teaching. It's one of the more puzzling elements of Buddhism. We talk about impermanence. Everybody seems to get it. Impermanence is one of those things you can't help but see, and your intellect kind of goes along with it. Yeah, my goodness, impermanence, all the moving around I've done, the way I look so different now than I used to, the way I feel differently about things, the people who have come and gone, just so obvious. But the teaching that there's actually no core of self at the heart of experience, that one people don't really warm to right away, or even after a long time. I had been involved with Buddhist practice for a long time, when there just arose in me this, and it kind of arose at the same time, this sense of that I had done some teaching. It wasn't like I had completely avoided that, but in doing that teaching, I actually recognized, wow, this is what I meant to do. But I couldn't see how to make a living at it. I couldn't see how to make it work with my family. And at that time, I had really young children. And so it's quite puzzling how to make that happen. And at the same time, I was also ill. I also had what was then called chronic fatigue syndrome. Now it's called myalgic encephalomyelitis, which sounds like a real disease, actually, instead of, chronic fatigue syndrome that sounds like you're just tired. And I was ailing. And I felt like I wouldn't get better unless I listened to some voice inside of me that said, Mark, your life isn't headed where you actually want it to head. So and I say we because my wife had to go along with this, we made a rather bold move in terms of me stopping working, which I kind of needed to do anyway. So in some sense, that was not that bold, but we moved from Seattle to Massachusetts, and I decided to go back to do intensive practice. The only way I could do that was if I wasn't working, I was a guy doing childcare. So anyway, through a whole variety of things that all sort of seemed fortuitous, my mother-in-law stepped forward to do 2 days a week of childcare. Kate found a job that got us health insurance that was only 3 days a week. And so for 4 days of the week, I actually could do this as a day job, so to speak. And we moved to Athol, where we could live quite cheaply, and rent out our house in Seattle. And I started going to IMS, Isaac as a commuter yogi. That's a whole story in itself. But mostly what I'm talking about this is the sense of it was kind of a crazy thing to do. To tell you the truth, I closed down my therapy practice in Seattle. I gave up my source of livelihood and all the connections I had in the professional world, and fixed up everything in the house so it could be rented. Somehow found the energy to do all that. It was a lot. And moved across the country to where I really knew almost nobody. And so it took heart, it took courage. But what sustained me, and it didn't all go well, I have to say. And I can't say that I was really met with open arms at Insight Meditation Society either. There were some discouraging moments, but I kept going back to this sense of what I had followed, sense of this is what I'm meant to do. Some place inside me, and it was really more of a belly thing, that knew, okay, this is the direction to go. Now, that's a pretty dramatic example. I don't expect most people to have dramatic examples, but maybe you do. Maybe you took a risk at some point in your life. Took a risk in the face of fear to trust something inside you. Took a leap. It's often easier to do when you're young because you have less, shall we say, investment in things as to where you live, what you do. Sometimes it's easier to take a risk. It was a little older for me to do it. I was actually close to 40, I think, when I did it. So it was one of those midlife crises. So yes and no. So there's something there for me. I spoke about, the discernment. We can trust the discernment in us of wholesome and unwholesome, which is an incredible skill to have, to be able to feel wholesome and unwholesome as they arise. And to catch yourself fooling yourself once in a while about that, trying to convince yourself something is wholesome when it isn't, especially around craving. So there's a learning curve to that. But simply discerning wholesome and unwholesome, I think, as important as that is, as crucial as that is to a well-lived life, there's also this other aspect of discerning one's unique path that no one else can know. In some sense, we can all know wholesome and unwholesome. Maybe that varies a little bit in context for individuals, but it's more of a general thing. But when it comes to our lives as individuals, we make choices that no one else can actually validate for us. It has to have an internal validation. We have to know in some way this is right. And there's a timing to it as well. I have this sense that it's not always time for things in one's life. It wasn't time for me to commit myself to what I needed to undergo to teach until it was time. And it came with a lot of urgency. And I didn't know that I would, have a deep understanding of the no self teaching. I just knew I needed one. I just knew I couldn't believe in myself as a teacher if I didn't really feel like I got that one. And so, oddly enough, it came. It came in its own time. And it kind of surprised me when it came, with the force at which it came. And it came through a whole process where, the first kind of insights to it made me wildly full of doubt and fear, I have to say. You're kind of coming up against the point at which your sense of self is losing its footing, shall we say. And your sense of self doesn't like that. It tries to reestablish itself through throwing a lot of fear and doubt at you. So there were some moments where I started to perceive the truth of this teaching, and just massive self-doubt arose. Not self-doubt, but doubt in the teaching. I shared, I can't remember if it was last time or the time before, about the moments when I thought, that I was losing my soul. These were similar in a way, because that is in some sense what the no self teaching says. There's this old Victorian translation that's kind of spooky of anatta as soullessness. It's a horrible translation because it makes people think that we're talking about zombies, these soulless beings going through life, not feeling anything. But it actually doesn't mean that at all. It means something closer to that we are like waves passing through water and energy, moment to moment, no solid core. It means something like we are nature acting in us. And we keep saying, I, me, mine, all over what are really natural processes. It means those things, but it means more. And so finally, there was a breakthrough where it was decidedly different than all the prior kinds of times when I began to have insight into it. That was convincing, that was utterly convincing. Everything fell completely away. It came at a very simple moment when I noticed I was watching thoughts, how they came all by themselves. They came uninvited. And it was like I had this moment of great interest in that. But what I didn't notice until suddenly I did was this subtle sense that I thought that I was what was mindful, that I would come back when I was suddenly mindful of a thought where I had been lost in the thought for a while, and then I would come back. It was a subtle thing. It was just a moment where I saw, oh, wow, mindfulness arises on its own. Something just snapped inside of me. And everything disappeared. And it reconstituted. I could see so clearly just the whole processes of the mind and the body without a core. So I was kind of surprised, I have to say, that the very thing that I aimed for came to me. The very thing I knew I lacked came. And there was suddenly like a confidence in what I was doing. But I felt like I could actually teach, I could actually transmit this to others and not feel like I was faking it. Not feel like I was kind of guessing at what that whole teaching meant. I had the experience. And it was self-validating. I didn't really need anybody else to say, yeah, you got it. I knew in that moment. So in the course of your lives, notice sometimes these subtle movements inside. One thing I also learned in that I like to let people know is there is something in us that wants to awaken. It's in everybody, I'm convinced. It is our destiny. But it's not always easy to notice it or feel it. Sometimes when I talk about it, though, people will notice it. They'll notice that there's something in them that wants awakening, even though you don't even know what that is, and you can't really know what it is till it happens. Something that wants to know the truth, something that wants blossom. You know, we get inklings, those questions, those nagging questions. Why am I here? What's going on? Why are there human beings at all? If you feel down into it, there's something really, and again, it's a belly kind of thing, I believe. There's something inside all of us that senses there's more than what appears here. That senses, when it hears the word awakening, senses something perk up its head, so to speak, inside. Awakening might not be your word, you know, words are trouble. When I was a young man, probably until about my mid to late 20s, I was more in the Christian orbit, and I felt it more as a longing for God. But the word changed. I didn't find that word very helpful. Sometimes people talk about oneness, non-separation. Sometimes people talk about love and surrender, deeply surrendering to something they feel drawing them, calling them. That is this belly thing I'm talking about. So if you've identified it, great. If you haven't identified it, it's fine too. Often there's a place and time when this will arise. Chances are, if you're taking a class like this, you've got something going in this realm. There's something going in this realm. And maybe it appears just as, I want to be more peaceful in my life, or I want to stay sober, or I want to be a better person, I want to be more loving. Often comes in a kind of a be a better person kind of form. And that's fine. Sometimes it comes in the form of of wanting to know who or what I am. And sometimes it comes with a crisis. A health crisis, a mental health crisis, or just a crisis. Sometimes it precipitates one. There's even an emotion that's named in Buddhism, samvega, or a sense of urgency that can arise from this. Sense of urgency, like I want to know the end of suffering. I want to realize that. And even the word I want is kind of troublesome because it seems to be the same kind of want as I want an ice cream cone. And I want to have a relationship, or I want this, I want that. And in some sense it is, it's all wanting. But this seems like a whole different order of things, a whole different level of wanting. And it's a wholesome wanting. Some wanting is wholesome. There's unfortunately the idea that it's all bad in the Buddhist view, all this wanting and desire. It's actually a bad translation of tanha, which is craving. Call it desire. There's another word for desire, chanda, which means aspirational desire. And it can be wholesome or unwholesome, depending on what it is you're aspiring to. So when the aspiration arises to be more peaceful or be more kind, that's a wholesome chanda, a wholesome desire. And every step along the way, I feel like faith is there. These aren't matters that are clear to the intellect. These aren't matters of intellectual knowledge. I can't prove any of this to you. If you want to see the evidence has all been in my own life as I've lived it. I can tell a story. I can point to maybe what's going on inside of you, but it's not a matter of proof. But I do think it's a matter of knowledge, but it's not head knowledge, it's heart knowledge. And I speak about it because I think it's not spoken of in very many places in this world, that this is there. All right, I think that's enough for tonight.